The advertisement in the Edmonton Journal said the position came with a private room, 3 meals a day, and a modest wage. It did not mention that the private room was a converted grain storage closet. It did not mention that the 3 meals a day depended entirely on whether the roads were passable. And it did not mention that the man who placed the ad had not spoken more than 40 words in a single conversation since 2009. The woman who answered the ad described herself as an experienced ranch administrator with a background in livestock records, account management, and general operations. She did not mention that her experience was theoretical, drawn from 4 years managing the books for a feed supply company in Calgary, where the closest she had come to an actual cow was the leather on her office chair. They were both optimists. That is a polite way of saying they were both wrong about almost everything. Wade Colter was 41 years old and ran a cattle operation outside Lacombe, Alberta that covered just under 800 acres of rolling parkland. He had inherited it from his father, who had inherited the stubbornness to run it from his father before that. The place was not struggling exactly, but it was not thriving either. Wade had spent 3 years keeping the books in a shoebox, scheduling veterinary appointments on a paper calendar that had gone missing in February, and managing 2 seasonal workers whose contracts he had renewed by handshake because he could not find the original paperwork. He was a good cattleman. He was a disastrous administrator. He needed someone who could bring order to the chaos without requiring him to explain himself too many times, because explaining himself was something Wade Colter had never been particularly skilled at, and after his wife left in 2017 he had stopped trying entirely. He did not want a partner. He wanted a system. He placed the ad because he needed someone who could manage what he could not, and because his accountant had used the phrase, catastrophic non-compliance during their last meeting, and that had sounded serious enough to act on. Iris Hadley was 36 years old and had spent the better part of a decade being excellent at jobs that underestimated her. She had a degree in agricultural business from the University of Guelph, a certificate in livestock management she had completed online during her lunch breaks, and a reputation at McKinnon Feed and Supply for being the only person who could read the inventory system without wanting to put a fist through the monitor. She was good at seeing how things were supposed to fit together. She was less good at pretending she did not notice when they did not. This quality, her directness, had made her indispensable to every employer she had ever had, and slightly exhausting to most of them at the same time. She had applied for the Lacombe position because she wanted to stop managing numbers for things she never got to touch. She wanted to work with actual land, actual animals, actual problems that had weight and smell and consequence. She had pictured something like the agricultural operations she had studied in school. Organized, documented. A filing system that made sense. A man who understood that record-keeping was not optional. What she drove up to on a Monday morning in late March was a yard that looked like it had recently survived something. There were 2 ATVs parked at angles that suggested they had been abandoned rather than parked. The barn door hung open. There was a dog sleeping directly in the middle of the driveway who did not move when she stopped the car, and she had to get out and step around it to approach the house. She knocked. There was a long silence. Then the door opened and Wade Colter looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of equipment he ordered, but is not sure he needed. He said, "You're the one from Calgary," she said. "Iris Hadley." Yes. He looked at her shoes. They were not the right shoes for a cattle operation in March. She had known this driving up and had not had time to stop for different ones. He said, "You want coffee?" She said, "I want to see the filing system first." There was a pause. He said, "I don't have one." She said, "I know. That's why I'm here." He looked at her for another moment, then stepped back and let her in. The kitchen table was buried. That was the only word for it. There were invoices, vaccination records, grazing lease renewals, equipment warranty cards, 2 years of fuel receipts, and what appeared to be a birthday card that had never been sent. There was a laptop with a cracked corner and a sticky note on it that said "Pass aus. Do not los" in handwriting that suggested some anxiety about this. There was a coffee mug with a pen in it and 7 pens on the table not in the mug. The shoebox her employer's accountant had referenced was real. It was on the counter. It had more than 1 shoebox's worth of paper in it, which meant the overflow was just loose on the counter around it. Iris Hadley stood in the kitchen of Wade Colter and did not say anything for a long moment. She set her bag on the one clear chair. She looked at the table. She looked at the shoebox. She looked at the sticky note. She said, "When did you last file a GST return?" He said, "I have a guy," she said. "When did your guy last file a GST return?" There was a pause that told her everything. She said, "I'm going to need a second table." Wade Colter's first impression of Iris Hadley was that she was going to be a problem. She was too direct. She asked too many questions and did not wait for the answer before she was already writing something down. She moved through his kitchen like she was cataloging it, which she was. And she had a way of pausing over a piece of paper, and then setting it down in a separate pile that made him feel like he was being assessed. His second impression, which arrived about 40 minutes later, when she had sorted the table into 7 distinct categories without asking him where anything went, and then made coffee without being told where anything was, because she had apparently noticed on the way in, was that she was going to be exactly what the accountant had said he needed. He did not tell her this. He drank his coffee. He went out to the barn. What Wade did not know yet, and would not know for some time because Iris Hadley did not volunteer information about herself unless it was directly relevant, was that she had not come to Lacombe because it was her first choice. She had come because her previous position had ended in the way positions end, when you are right too often. And your employer is not the kind of person who finds that useful. The feed company had restructured, which was their word for it, and Iris's department had been absorbed into a larger regional office, which was their word for letting her go, without having to say they were letting her go. She had 2 months of savings, a storage unit in Calgary with her furniture in it, and a very clear sense that she did not want to spend another year managing spreadsheets for people who did not understand what the spreadsheets were actually telling them. She had pictured a working ranch, functional, organized enough to be worth organizing further. A man who was busy but competent, who needed help with the administrative side, because he was genuinely occupied with the operational side. Someone who would appreciate what she brought and leave her alone to bring it. What she had was a kitchen table that had not seen its own surface in 2 years. A barn door that she would later learn had been hanging slightly off its track since November, an employer who communicated in fragments, and a grain closet that smelled like 1987 no matter how many times she opened the window. She did not complain. She made a list. The first weeks were difficult in a specific way that had nothing to do with the work and everything to do with the silence. Wade Colter did not make conversation. He appeared at meals, ate with the focused efficiency of a man who considered eating a task to complete rather than an experience to have, and then left. He answered questions with the minimum number of words the question required. He did not ask her questions in return, not because he was rude, she eventually decided, but because he had spent enough years alone that asking questions had become something he did only when he genuinely could not figure something out himself, and he had become very good at figuring things out himself. The problem was that Iris was used to workplaces where information moved, where someone told you what was happening before you had to ask, where there was a handover, a briefing, something. Here there was a sticky note and a shoebox, and a man who communicated on a need-to-know basis, and seemed to have a very narrow definition of what she needed to know. She asked him once, in the second week, what the schedule was for the next month. He said, depends on the weather. She said, what's the plan if the weather cooperates? He said, move the herd to the east pasture. Check the fence line. Vet comes on the 14th, she said. I'll put it in the system. He said, what system? She said, the one I'm building. He looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, not hostility exactly. More like a man watching someone install something in his house and not being sure yet whether he had agreed to this. He did not say anything. He went back out to the yard. She built the system anyway. It was not the work that wore on her. The work made sense to her in a way that spreadsheets for feed supply orders never fully had. Here the numbers meant something physical. This invoice corresponded to those calves. That record meant the vet had been out in October and found nothing to worry about. The grazing lease renewal meant those acres, the ones she could see from the grain closet window in the morning when the frost was still on the grass. She liked that the numbers had weight. She liked that when she got them right, something real was protected. What wore on her was the quiet. And underneath the quiet, the steady awareness that she had arrived here, with credentials, and a plan, and the man she was working for had looked at her shoes, and formed an opinion that she had been working against ever since. She was right about that, and she was wrong about it at the same time. Wade Colter had looked at her shoes. He had noticed they were wrong for the mud and the cold. He had also noticed, in the same moment, that she had gotten out of the car and stepped around the dog without hesitating, and that when he opened the door she had not done the thing people did when they first saw the kitchen. The small flinch, the polite adjustment of expression. She had just looked at it the way a mechanic looks at an engine. Like it was a problem, and problems had solutions, and she was interested in solutions. He had not said any of this because he did not say things like this, but he had thought it, and he had gone out to the barn that first morning, not because he had work waiting, though he did, but because standing in the kitchen while she reorganized, it had produced in him an unfamiliar sensation that he needed about 40 minutes of cold air to process. The first month passed. The system Iris built was not complicated, it was just consistent. Invoices here, vet records here, equipment maintenance log which had not previously existed here. She color-coded the calendar, in a way that made him feel slightly managed, but when the vet called to confirm the 14th, he knew without having to look for anything that the 14th was a Wednesday. And he had already cleared the morning. And that was a new feeling. He did not tell her that either. In the second month, she asked him about the east fence line. She had been going through the land records and had found a note in the margin of an old lease document, handwritten, that said check corner posts, soft ground. She did not know when it had been written or who had written it. She found him in the barn crouched beside a piece of equipment he was working on, and she showed him the note. He looked at it. He said, "My dad wrote that." She said, "When?" He said, "Probably 2004. Maybe 2005. She said, "Have you checked the corner posts since then?" There was a pause. He said, "I know the fence line." She said, "I'm sure you do. But the note says soft ground and that's a drainage issue, and if the posts have shifted at all since 2004 you could have a section that's not holding like you think it is." He looked at her. She looked back. She had the particular stillness of someone who has made a point and is prepared to wait as long as necessary for it to land. He said, "I'll check it this week." She said, "I can come." He said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know. I want to see the property anyway. I've been looking at it on maps for 2 months. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Saturday, early." She said, "How early?" He said, "Before it gets muddy." She said, "That tells me nothing." He almost did something with his mouth that was not quite a smile. He said, 6. She said, "I'll be ready." Saturday came. She was ready at 5:50 and waiting by the ATV when he came out of the house. He registered this and said nothing. They drove out to the east fence line in the early light, with the parkland spread out around them. The aspen stands still bare, the grass pale and pressed flat from the winter. It was the kind of morning that Alberta does in April, that makes you forget it was 40 below in January. The sky was the color of something being decided. She did not talk much. He noticed that. He had expected her to ask questions the whole way out, the way she did in the kitchen when she was building the system. Instead she looked. She watched the land the way he watched it, noting things, cataloging, seeing what was there without needing to narrate it. The corner posts on the southeast section had shifted. Not dramatically. "Enough," she said. "I see what your father meant." He crouched down and dug at the base of the post with his hand. The ground gave in a way it should not have. He sat back on his heels and looked at it. He said, "I haven't been out this far since fall," she said. "How many posts do you think?" He said, 4, maybe 6, she said. "I can help set them if you tell me what to do." He looked at her. She was wearing the right boots today. He noticed that too, though he did not mention it. He said, "You know how to set a post?" she said. "I know how to follow instructions." "You said that's not the same thing." "I'm telling you I learn fast." He looked at her for a moment that lasted a beat longer than practical. Then he stood up and said, "Get the digger from the back." She did not say anything. She got the digger. They worked on the fence line for 4 hours. It was cold and the ground was heavier than it looked, and by the end of it she had blisters on both palms from the post driver and mud on her jacket to the elbow. He worked beside her without commentary, showing her once how to set the depth gauge, correcting the angle of one post with his hand over hers briefly and without ceremony, and then moving to the next without making anything of it. On the drive back she said, "Your father kept good notes." He said he kept notes on everything. She said, "You have more of them?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "In the office binders. I haven't gone through them." She said, "Can I?" He said. "Why?" She said. "Because whoever taught him to run this place taught him something, and it's probably still in those binders, and I'd rather read it than make the same mistakes twice." He drove for a while without answering. The parkland moved past them, the aspen stands casting long shadows in the morning light. Then he said, "They're on the bottom shelf. Behind the tax stuff." She said, "Thank you." He said, "Some of that's hard to..." His handwriting. She said, "I'll manage." He believed her. He was not sure when he had started believing things she said, but somewhere in the last 2 months it had happened without his noticing. The binders were extraordinary. Not in any formal sense. They were just the accumulated notes of a man who had paid attention to the same piece of land for 40 years. Weather patterns, pasture rotation schedules, which sections flooded in a wet spring, which bulls had thrown difficult calves, notes on neighbors, fences, water rights, the particular behavior of the creek that ran along the north boundary in August. There were sketches, rough but precise, of the drainage patterns on the east property. There was a section titled simply, "Things I Got Wrong," that ran to 11 pages. Iris read them over 3 evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp on while Wade watched the news in the other room. She made notes in the margin of her own notebook. Cross-referenced. Built a reference document that organized everything by category and date. On the 4th evening, Wade came in from checking the cattle and found her at the table as usual, and he poured himself a coffee and did not go back to the other room. He sat down across from her. She looked up. He said, "What are you finding?" She said. "Your father knew this land better than most people know their own addresses." He said, "He was here 52 years, she said. "It shows. He has a note from 1987 about a section of the north pasture that floods in May if the snow comes off too fast. Did you know about that?" He said, "I knew about it." She said, "It's not in anything I've seen." He said, "It was in my head." She said, "Wade, information in your head is not a system. It's a liability." He looked at her. She looked back with the same calm she always had. Direct, not unkind, just honest in the way that some people are honest and most people find exhausting until they realize it is actually a gift. He said, "You're right." She had not expected that. She had expected a pause, or a deflection, the same slight resistance he brought to most of her observations. She had been prepared to wait him out. He said, "My father tried to tell me that, I didn't listen." She said, "You're listening now." He said, "I'm trying." She went back to her notes. He sat there a while longer with his coffee, not watching the news, not going anywhere in particular. It was a different kind of quiet than the one she had been living in for 2 months. That quiet had been the absence of something. This was just two people in a kitchen at the end of a day, not needing to fill it. She noticed the difference. She did not say anything about it. The thing that changed everything happened in June, on a Thursday, in the middle of a crisis that announced itself without warning the way crises on a cattle operation always do. A storm came through in the afternoon, fast and heavy, the kind that the forecast had mentioned as a chance of showers, and that turned out to be a wall of hail that crossed the property in 20 minutes, and left the north pasture looking like it had been worked over. The herd scattered. 2 sections of the fence line that bordered the highway went down under a fallen poplar. Wade was on the far west end of the property when it hit, checking water levels completely out of contact. Iris heard it from the office. She stood at the window and watched it cross the yard, and then, before it had fully passed, she was already pulling on her jacket. She did not know the property the way he did. She knew it the way someone knows a place from reading about it and from 4 hours on an ATV and from binders in a farmhouse office. She knew where the north pasture boundary was. She knew which gate led to the highway side. She knew that a herd of cattle that had just been hailed on in an open field would move toward cover, and that the closest cover was the tree line that ran along the highway fence. She drove the ATV out with the fence repair kit in the back, which she had restocked and reorganized in April so that everything was where it should be. She found the downed poplar on the fence line, and 2 of the sections it had taken with it, and beyond the gap she could see 4, 5, 6 animals drifting toward the shoulder of the highway. She did not know how to repair that fence by herself. She knew how to call the county road office, and she knew where the emergency contact numbers were, in the binder she had made, and she knew that the most important thing in the next 4 minutes was to not let any more cattle get through that gap. She pulled the ATV across the gap at an angle and stood beside it in the rain that was still coming down, and waved her arms at the animals nearest the opening until they turned. It was not a technique, it was the only thing she could think of. She did it for 25 minutes until Wade came across the field in the truck, having picked up her message on the way back, and took over the fence repair while she kept the ATV in position. The cattle did not get onto the highway. None were lost. When it was done, when the temporary sections were up, and the herd was moving back toward the center of the pasture, Wade came back to where she was standing beside the ATV with rain in her hair and her arms tired, and what he recognized as the expression of a person who has spent the last half hour being more afraid than they showed. He said, "How did you know where the fence line was?" She said, "Your father's drainage sketch. I cross-referenced it with the satellite map last month. I wanted to know the whole property." He said nothing for a moment. She said, "I should have had a better kit for the poplar. I couldn't move it alone." He said, "You held the gap," she said, "with an ATV and both arms. It wasn't technical. It worked." She looked at the pasture. The herd was settling. The rain was letting up. The highway was clear. She said, "I couldn't have done the fence repair without you." He said, "You wouldn't have needed to if I'd been on this side of the property." She said, "You couldn't have known." He said, "I should have had a better radio." She said, "I should have had bolt cutters for the poplar." They stood there for a moment in the wet post-storm air, the 2 of them cataloging what had gone wrong and what had held, the way people do when they have just gotten through something together. Then Wade said, "Come inside. I'll make something." She said, "You cook?" He said, "I didn't say I cooked. I said I'd make something." She said, "What's the difference?" He said, "About 40 minutes and realistic expectations." She looked at him. He was not quite smiling, but there was something in the vicinity. She thought, not for the first time, that he was funnier than he let on. She said, "All right." The summer passed in the way that summers on a working ranch pass, which is to say relentlessly. There was no such thing as a slow week. There was haying and pasture rotation, and a second cut that ran 3 days behind schedule because of equipment trouble, and a calf that needed bottle feeding for 2 weeks when its mother rejected it, and the ongoing project of turning 2 years of administrative chaos into something that could survive Wade being unavailable for 48 hours without everything grinding to a halt. He started leaving her notes. Not long ones. Single lines sometimes, on the small notepad by the barn door. Things like, "Water line to east trough running slow, check valves." Or, "Henderson's cutting their alfalfa this week, might want their baler schedule." The first few times she found them she thought he had just been putting information where it would be found. It was only in July when she found one that said, "Good catch on the grazing rotation." My father would have agreed that she understood it was something else. She wrote back. She started leaving her own notes on the same pad. Not many words. Things like variance in fuel costs going down, something working. or called the co-op about the net wrap. Better price if we order before August. He read them. She knew because the notepad was always in a slightly different position when she came back to it. They did not talk about this system, it just existed. In late August, she found him sitting on the step outside the barn in the evening, after the day's work was done, looking at the aspen stand on the west edge of the property. The light was doing what it does in Alberta at the end of August, long and amber, and somehow both ending and not ending at the same time. She had a question about the fall vaccination schedule, but she held it for a moment. She sat down on the step beside him, not close, not far, and looked at the same thing he was looking at. He said after a while, "My father used to sit here," she said. "I figured it was something like that." He said he'd come out after supper. Said it was the only time the place looked like it was resting. She looked at the light on the aspens. She said he was right. He said, "You see why I stayed." It was not a question, she thought about it anyway. She said, "I see why anyone would stay." He looked at her then just briefly and then back at the aspens. He said, "The woman who had this job before you lasted 11 days. She said, "What happened?" He said. "She drove to Red Deer to get milk and didn't come back." She said she just left. He said. "Left a note. Said she'd underestimated the commute." Iris looked at the amber light on the grass. She said, "The commute to where?" He said, "That was the part I didn't fully understand." She almost laughed. It came out as a sound that was more complicated than a laugh but contained one. He heard it. She said, "I'm not going to drive to Red Deer and not come back." He said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "You reorganized the feed room last week. Nobody does that and then leaves." She said, "That's your measure?" He said, "It's a reasonable one." She thought about telling him that she had reorganized the feed room, because it had been bothering her since April, and she had finally had a Saturday morning free. And it had nothing to do with her intentions regarding her employment. She thought about it and then she did not say it. Because it occurred to her that he was right in a way that had nothing to do with the feed room specifically. She had reorganized it because she was invested. Because this place had become something to her over these months. The binders with his father's handwriting, the east fence line, the calf she had bottle-fed for 2 weeks and named Frank to herself without telling anyone, the notepad by the barn door, the light in the aspens. She was not going anywhere. She said, "You have a drainage issue in the low section of the south pasture that's going to be worse in the spring if we don't address it before freeze-up." He said, "I know." She said, "I want to map it properly and price out the tile drainage before October." He said, "Do it?" She said, "I'll need a full afternoon out there with the GPS unit." He said, "Take mine, it's in the office top drawer." She said, "Thank you." He said, "You don't have to thank me." She said, "I'm aware, I'm choosing to." He looked at her again. That same beat, the one that had started happening after the fence line in April, a fraction longer than necessary. Long enough to mean something even if neither of them was in any hurry to say what. Then he stood up. He said, "I'm going to start supper." She said, "You're cooking again?" He said, "I'm making something again." "There's a difference." She said, "You keep saying that. What actually is the difference?" He held the barn door and looked back at her. He said, "About 40 minutes and a lower chance of disappointment." She said, "That's just cooking with managed expectations." He said, "Most things are." She stayed on the step a little longer after he went in, looking at the light coming off the aspens, thinking about managed expectations, and what they had become over the course of 8 months, and how the thing you built when you stopped trying to get what you expected, was sometimes better than anything you'd thought to ask for. In November of that year, Wade Colter's accountant called to say that the books were the cleanest they had been in a decade and asked what had changed. Wade said, "I hired someone." The accountant said, "Good hire." Wade said, "Yes." He did not say anything else. He was not a man who said more than the situation required. But after he hung up, he went to find Iris in the office, where she was cross-referencing the fall vaccination records against the breeding schedule for next spring, and he said, "The accountant called." She looked up. He said the books are the best they've been in 10 years. She said, 11 actually, based on the records I found. But close enough. He said, "I wanted you to know." She said, "I appreciate that." He said, "It's not just the books." She looked at him for a moment. He did not look away. She said, "I know." He said, "I'm not good at saying things like that." She said, "You just did." There was a silence that was not awkward, just full. Outside, the November wind was working on the yard. Inside, the lamp was on and the records were in order. And the notepad by the barn door had a new note on it that he had not read yet. And the tile drainage project for the south pasture was scheduled for next spring, and the binders from his father were indexed now in a way that meant nothing would be lost again. He said, "Do you want to stay past the contract term?" She said, "I was wondering when you'd ask." He said, "I'm asking now." She said, "Yes, but I want a proper desk. Not the corner of the kitchen table." He said, "You can have the office." She said, "You work in there." He said, "We can work in there." She looked at him. He meant it. She could see that he meant it. And she had learned over 8 months that this man did not say things he did not mean. Which meant when he said them they counted. She said, "All right." He said, "All right." He went back out to finish the evening chores. She went back to the vaccination records. The lamp stayed on. Iris Hadley Colter spent the next 22 years on that property. The drainage project in the south pasture worked so well that they expanded it in 2004. The east fence line was rebuilt properly in 2028, corner posts and all. The binders from Wade's father were eventually donated to the Agricultural Archives at the University of Alberta, where a professor of prairie land history called them among the most detailed personal land records she had ever seen from a working operation. Wade learned to use the filing system. It took him about a year to stop putting things in the wrong place, and another 6 months after that to stop apologizing for it. He read every book Iris ordered for the small shelf she put up in the office. Eventually, though some of them he read at a pace that suggested a complicated relationship with recreational reading, Iris became, over time, the person in the Lacombe agricultural district, who other people called when they had a land records problem, or a grazing lease question or a drainage issue they could not figure out. She developed a reputation for being direct, which surprised no one who had met her, and thorough, which surprised some people who had underestimated what direct and thorough together actually looked like over the long run. Wade once told a neighbor, at a meeting about the water cooperative, that the best thing he had ever done for the operation was hire someone who knew what he did not. The neighbor said, "You mean the administration stuff?" Wade said, "I mean everything I couldn't see because I'd been looking at it too long." He did not elaborate. He was not a man who elaborated. But those of us who have known stories like this one, stories that begin with a misleading advertisement, and a woman in the wrong shoes, and a man who had not cleared a kitchen table in 2 years, know what he meant. She came expecting an organized operation and a man who understood record keeping. He came expecting someone to manage the paperwork and stay out of the way. They were both wrong. What they built instead, out of drainage maps and barn door notes, and a herd that did not get onto the highway and a lamp still on in the office at 9 o'clock in the evening, was something neither of them had known how to ask for. Because neither of them had known yet that it was possible. I think about that sometimes. What we order from life because it seems practical, and what we get instead when we're paying attention. Tell me, who do you think changed more? The man who had everything figured out about the land, but nothing figured out about being known? Or the woman who knew how to build a system for everything except what to do, when the thing she was building started to feel like home?